1957 was a special year for Chrysler as it introduced a completely new lineup with the so-called forward look, or the new look of motion, as some advertisements called it. And across the Plymouth, Dodge, Desoto, Chrysler, and Imperial lineups, all the vehicles had just a beautiful aesthetic to them. In fact, it was really these vehicles that set the industry standard for design, and it was the first time in a number of years that Chrysler was leading the pack when it came from design. It kind of stole the design crown from General Motors, who was the style leader up until that point. And in point of fact, Buick had outsold every other mid-priced make to this point since 1949. However, in 1957, some of that picture would change as customers were looking for something different. And at the local Chrysler showroom, they had cars like this beautiful 1957 Desoto that you see here. Now, Desoto was named after Hernando Desoto, and Chrysler produced Desotos from 1928 through the 1961 model year. So it had a pretty long run, but by 1959, the end was near. And this is despite 1957 being a relatively successful year for Desoto. In fact, the make sold 117,000 cars in that particular year, and it's no, let's say, challenge to see why when you take a look at this photo here of this 57. Of course, it was these 1957 Chrysler products that really introduced the super prominent tail fin to the buying public. In fact, the tail fins on these 57 Chrysler products were so tall that General Motors did a complete melt and repour on what was going to be the 1959 models, because when designers saw these vehicles that were coming out for the 1957 model year from Chrysler, they just knew what they were working on was not going to captivate the public nearly as much as these vehicles would. And so you have, in one case, an example of a reaction to Chrysler, the 1959 Cadillac, that was the supreme development of the fin for General Motors. And you also have other finned vehicles from 1959 GM, like the Chevrolet with the iconic Batwing rear, as well as the Buick with these beautiful tail fins. But back to Chrysler. Chrysler was headed up, the styling department was headed up by a man named Virgil Exner. And for 1957, Exner told the press that tail fins were really a natural and contemporary symbol of motion, and they appeared on nature's creatures as well as aircraft, speedboats, racing cars, guided missiles, and rockets. And Exner and his team just wanted to captivate what was going on. Remember, this was the time when space and rockets were generally pretty exciting to the overall buying public. Well, Sputnik aside, that would be launched around this time as well. And so the cars kind of just were a representation of what was happening in the public at the time. Now, an interesting anecdote about these fins is that while Virgil Exner is credited with the development of these fins and overall styling for the Chrysler products during this time frame, and he clearly was the chief designer, one of his underlings at the time, a gentleman by the name of Don Kopka, in other interviews, has alluded to the fact that Exner actually never really supported these super huge fins. But the design team had put together a couple proposals for the board of directors, one that had much tamer fins that Exner supported, and then these extreme fins that ended up on the production cars. And the board apparently at the review loved the fin cars so much that they bought them and not what Exner had really wanted to propose. So that's a story that I haven't heard anywhere else, but as I said, Don Kopka related it. He worked in the Chrysler studios during that time frame. He would later rise to become a chief designer at Ford Motor Company. So an interesting anecdote about the fins. But onward now to a discussion of the 1959 Desotos. Interestingly, Desoto would end up inviting 4,000 dealers to Detroit in the fall of 1958 to see these new 1959 Desotos and to celebrate 30 years of production because the market started in 1928. And they unveiled a series of cars that were still handsome and had those fins like the 57s did when they were introduced. The 60 would be a more considerable restyle for the Desoto, but the 59 was a more muted restyle of the original 57s. And dealers generally thought that these new 1959 models were quite acceptable. And that was in part because they were hoping that the cars not only had the style that the 1957s have, but also that they had better build quality by this point. Unfortunately, one of the things that was really an Achilles heel of the 1957 Chrysler products across the lineup was that they looked beautiful, but they had all sorts of issues, whether that was from the way that they were engineered or the way that they were put together. Everything from mismatched paint to parts that didn't work to rusting out early, in part because these cars didn't have fender liners that went all the way around the wheel, so a lot of the salt and snow would pack itself in behind the headlamp bezels, and then that top of the fender would rust out. They just were not well-built cars, and I think this is one of the reasons why the Desoto production, which was emblematic, candidly, of Chrysler production figures, would go from 117,000 units in that 1957 model year down to 49,000 in 1958, and then the 1959 Desoto lineup sold just 45,000 units across a number of different body styles. There was the Firesweep. That was the low-priced Desoto that rode atop 122-inch wheelbase and stickered for around $3,000 back at the time. And there was the Firedome. This was the bigger car, 126-inch wheelbase, like all the more expensive Desotos. The Fireflite, and then the Adventure was the top car. And if you wanted a hardtop coupe Adventure, stickered for around $4,400. The hardtop convertible stickered for around $4,700. So there were quite a few different models in the lineup. And of course, there were hardtop coupes, sedans, convertibles, four-door sedans. And then there were the station wagons, the Shopper and the Explorer. Ooh. And on your 1959 Desotos, you got a number of refinements over those initial model years, including a number of braces and fasteners and more sound deadener that really should have been on the 1957s in the first place to help quell some squeaks and rattles. Chrysler also made the dash-mounted rearview mirror a bit longer so that it was easier to see out the back, and build quality significantly improved. But this was kind of a time where it was getting more and more difficult for the mid-priced makes to have success. So DeSoto sales did plummet, in part because of the quality issues from the 1957 models, but also because the U.S. economy was trending toward a recession in the late 1950s, and it was really the mid-priced vehicles like DeSoto and Dodge, as well as Buick and Pontiac and Mercury that really got hit hard. But Chrysler got especially hard hit in this recessionary period, unfortunately. And of course, there is one make that really got hit hard during this, Edsel, and launched in 58, gone after the 1960 model year. Now, under the hood in the DeSoto had some really good engines. Chrysler engines were typically very, very well engineered, aside from some specific cases where they would use, I would say, components from suppliers like the electrojector fuel injection that was available in previous years. That was a total dog, and I believe all of the cars that were so equipped with that electrojector fuel injection were recalled by Chrysler. Wouldn't be the first time that Chrysler kind of went into the fuel injection space and failed. Another instance would be the 1981 to 83 Imperial with the fuel-injected 318. But the standard engine in the Firesweep was now a 361 cubic inch, 295 horsepower engine. The Firedome, Fireflite, and Adventure had 383 cubic inch V8s, and there were different horsepowers available, 305, 325, 350 horsepower, and the lattermost of which had dual four-barrel carburetors. So you had some pretty powerful engines that were available in your DeSoto at the time. And you could get lots of interesting equipment. You could get swivel front seats like you see here. There was also automatic headlamp dimming. And of course, you had Chrysler's torsionaire suspension that was introduced in 1957. The torsion bars up front and the leaf spring rear. One of the great things about the suspension is that in addition to providing good cornering, Chrysler had re-engineered the control arms and the overall suspension geometry so that they were inclined a little bit, and in the event that you pushed on the brake pedal and slowed the car down, it would actually help keep the car level. The new suspension system would help prevent brake dive, and it worked very well. It was something that other car makers were doing around this time too. Now, it's clear that the 1959 DeSotos were lookers. Even this four-door pillared sedan is a great looker with this very thin roof and beautiful tail fins and It's hard to improve upon this for a four-door sedan, a family car. How could you get something that was much better looking than this? But let's take a look at some of the clay models for the 1959 model, because let's just say they weren't as graceful. And this was during a time period in which Chrysler was envisioning a more heavy restyle for the 1959 model year DeSotos that ended up not coming. Now here's the front end of one of the proposals. You can see the license plate. It says 1959 DeSoto there. Obviously, Chrysler was thinking of transitioning to dual stacked headlamps. Remember, by this point, quad headlamps were just becoming acceptable in all 50 states. That would happen kind of in between 1957 and 1958. And so there was this debate on what to do with that. The 59 DeSoto obviously went with the horizontal headlamps. Here you see a stacked headlamp treatment. Looks like there are some subtle differences between the driver's and the passenger side. The driver's side has some larger nacelles around the headlamps versus what's on the passenger side. But you've got this kind of hugely carved out, sculpted area for the headlamps underneath an oversized hood, if you will, for the fender. You do have a trapped hood design on this particular vehicle, a mini kind of egg crate grille with the V in the middle, and huge block lettering that spells out DeSoto on the front. This kind of looks chunky and heavy to my eyes, not anything like what the 1957 Chryslers kind of appeared to be, which was very light. And here's the rear of a vehicle, again with alternate driver and passenger sides. The passenger side is a bit heavier-handed. Both sides look heavy-handed. This almost looks cartoonish, I would say. Look at that kind of sculpted out area for the tail lamps, and the bumper treatment is different. You can see there's a single light on the right side that's incorporated into the bumper versus a dual light on the left side. And, overall, like I said, I just think this looks cartoonish, and I'm thankful they didn't go with it. You do have, I would say, some interesting features on this from a modeling perspective. You do have that nice sculpted out area, let's say, in the tail panel where it has that mid-century style lettering that says DeSoto. And let's take a look at this particular one. Again, you can see that stacked headlamp theme, but now you've got a different grille. You've kind of got two grilles here. The lower portion with that fine mesh, and then a thicker texture grille above that. And you still have this sculpted area around the stacked headlamps. A chunkier bumper, more like the 57 Chryslers and the Plymouths a little bit. And it looks like they're trying to do something different and assess different windshields between the driver and passenger side as well on this particular model. And if you thought the front of that car was crazy, take a look at the rear. Again, you've got alternate proposals on the driver's and passenger side. The driver's side, let's just say it's kind of approximating what would come out for 1959. You got those triple tail lights. The top of the fender would extend a bit more over the rear on the production 59 versus what you see here, but it's relatively close. The bumper actually is not all that far off of the production 59 either, although the side profile, the design of the bumper on the side here is different. But look at that passenger side. What in the world is that? Like this big tubular form that goes into the bumper, and the tail lamp is really far inboard on the car. That is just the wackiest proposal maybe that I've seen ever for a rear end design, certainly from Chrysler in this time frame. I do not know what the designers were thinking. Crazy stuff. Let's take a look at one last proposal. This is a rear three-quarter view, again, of another model that's got different driver side and passenger side proposal with very strange quarter panel, although that would kind of come to fruition as DeSoto would have its final model years. You see a little bit of that in the final DeSotos, but I don't know what's going on with that. I'll say the way that the rear quarter panel has that semicircular form there at the rear of it kind of reminds me a little bit of a 1954 Buick Skylark rear. I can't really think of anything else that reminds me of. But notice on the driver's side that there's the three tail lamp design in a horizontal theme as opposed to the typical vertical theme that clearly DeSoto was proposing on a number of other models, and that was what would actually end up in production. So whole bunch of proposals here. What's your favorite, the final production version or any of these? I have to say I think the final production version was probably the right choice. The rear three-quarter of the final production version I think looks great. The front end looks a little bit tepid. I like the 57 probably the best. But overall, a wonderful looking car, but just something that was not good enough, frankly, to propel Desoto to enough sales success that could stave off its extinction that would come soon in 1961. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the 1959 Desoto. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Put a comment in what was your favorite 1959 Desoto design, the final production version or one of the proposals. Thanks again for watching.